Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to present on the issue of psychological effects of immigration and exile, and in particular look at some of the psychological factors impacting the lives of immigrant and refugee students. My background is that I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an associate professor at Boston College Department of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology. So I bring with me both an academic research hat as well as I do have a practice as well in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The majority of people that I work with are immigrant adolescents and adults. So with that being said, I will begin the presentation. So Denzel has given you a nice overview of some statistics related to immigration. But just as a quick overview, we have in the United States in particular, and global immigration is a very large topic, so I'm going to focus specifically on the United States in my presentation. But about 38.5, now close to 40 million people in the U.S. are foreign-born. And as you all know, the United States is a land of native, immigrant, and refugee people, and both forced migration as well as voluntary migration. There have been several waves of immigrants from different continents, a series of immigration acts and policies in the United States that have led to exclusion of immigration as well as the influx of immigration at various points in history. We have about 11 million. I would say that this is a relatively recent figure, but it's gone down over the past 2 years, about 11 million undocumented immigrants, and various reasons for migrating. So if we take a look at why people immigrate, children, adolescents, and I would say adults as well, the areas of manufacturing, agriculture, service, the knowledge sector, so a lot of different reasons for work. People also migrate due to war and humanitarian crises, environmental catastrophes. Here we see the floods in Pakistan from a number of years ago. But the biggest reason for people's migration to the United States, actually the most prevalent reason, is reunification with family members. This is often overlooked. Oftentimes we have the idea that immigrants are seeking only economic opportunities. While that is a big factor, actually people are trying to reunite with family members and settle together. We also have a growing population of children of immigrants. In fact, if you look at these statistics here, the vast majority, over 80%, of both first and second generation children are citizens. So when I say first generation, I'm referring to those individuals who are born outside of the United States. Second generation, those being born in the United States. I know there are a lot of different terms used for first and second generation, but that's my reference point. If you look at the slide a little bit further, you'll see the complicated nature of immigration, that we have oftentimes mixed documentation within a family. So we might have a citizen child, a dreamer, right, and we might have an adult in the family and an older adult without documentation. Most often, people enter the United States with some kind of temporary status, temporary visa status, and then they may overstay those visas, oftentimes to remain close to their families, staying together. And so when you think about the narrative, as Denzel was saying, around immigration, oftentimes we hear the narrative that people are trying to violate the law with some kind of ulterior motive, and oftentimes it's really to stay with their families. And if you think about people who migrate, they enter relationships with people who are citizens, whether it's through marriage or in some other way, even work relationships. So they do stay on for reasons that are often left out of that narrative that we typically hear about. So I want to say a little bit about the context of migration and what that involves, because if we have the context in our minds, we can better understand then, well, what is the psychology of migration and exile. for children, adolescents, and adults. So the first thing we think about in psychology is the pre-migration context. We think about why young people and adults migrate. What is the reason for that? Is it employment? Is it education? Is it to be with family? Is it trying to escape persecution or disaster or poverty? And we think about what is the nature of the pre-migration context. So it's not, oftentimes we focus on assessing what happens after somebody comes to the United States. And what I'm suggesting is that it's just as important to really think about what was the nature of life that was left behind. What is the access that one has to family and peers? What is the separation from family members like? And when we think about family, we need to broaden that concept from a nuclear idea of family and really think about extended family, uncles, aunts, grandparents who often play a significant role in the development of children in various parts of the country. We also think about a separation from a cultural and a linguistic context, so what's familiar to the child or to the adult, and to think about the kinds of everyday life things that they miss. I had a colleague who would miss seeing certain objects in his country of origin on a day-to-day basis, and this is often why you see the recreation of ethnic enclaves and support systems and temples and mosques and churches and different kinds of institutions within the United States because of the psychological loss that's experienced in this process of migration. In the pre-migration context, we also see that immigrants hope for a better future for their family and for themselves. So the idea of the optimism that allows immigrants to actually relocate and to leave what is familiar to them. In terms of the post-migration context, so what happens upon arrival, right? And of course, there's the transit, the journey from the pre-migration context to the post-migration context. Often the journey can involve a great deal of trauma for some migrants. But in terms of the post-migration context, migration is typically seen by immigrants and refugees as significant for the whole family. So it's not typical that we see many immigrants and refugees talking about their own personal sense of loss, but rather the sense of loss for the entire family or changes within the family that is thought of more collectivistically. And the sense of optimism, it coexists with a sense of disillusion or disorientation. So particularly a couple of years into the migration process and moving to the U.S., oftentimes that sense of hope is at times overtaken, but certainly balanced out through a sense of disillusion that things are not quite how they had hoped it would be. There's also complexity of children and parents being reunited after long periods of separation. Sometimes we see parents sending their children to live with relatives in the United States to secure their safety from civil war or from conflict or severe poverty. So when we look at those situations, there are psychological challenges in this reunification process between the parents and the children. How do you then attach to one another when you've actually been living these very separate lives, oftentimes for many, many years? The post-migration context also involves the realities of xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and racism. If we look at the demographic trends of migration over the last 30 years, 40 years, we see significant differences in terms of the racial makeup of immigrants and refugees in the United States. So oftentimes these racial labels that we have in the United States are irrelevant to people who are living in other countries. They have other kinds of distinctions perhaps within society, maybe based on social class, but the idea that one is assigned a race upon arriving to the United States is often not anticipated by immigrants or refugees. And in the United States, we're sort of used to this type of racializing of human beings and placing them within a racial hierarchy. So when you look at the composition of immigrants, the racial composition of immigrants over the last 40 years, you'll see that they are immigrants of color. In contrast to the immigration of Ellis Island, which was largely from Europe. And even then there were racialized types of policies and attitudes that were prevalent, certainly towards Irish immigrants and Jewish immigrants. And as Denzel mentioned, we see this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that has come in and out of history in the United States, but much of that is centered around racialization and racism. And that's really a significant part of children and adolescent socialization in the United States. And then more recently, we see policies. The policy level, of course, is extremely significant in the post-migration context, where you have the policy that's in flux and the instability that it creates, both psychologically and physically, for human beings as they don't know what's going to happen next. And the travel ban, the more recent travel ban, or what's been called the Muslim ban, is one example of this, where families, children, adults are struggling with what will happen next and how can I secure my safety and the safety of my family. And so when the socio-political climate is in flux in this way, and every day seems like it's unpredictable and it feels unpredictable, it's very difficult then to feel as though you have actually arrived anywhere, even though you've been living in that context for many years and perhaps even a generation or so. So this is another large impingement on the psychological life of immigrants and refugees. I want to also think about the post-migration context and in relation to stereotypes, and look at some of the prevailing stereotypes that we do have about immigration in the United States. So one stereotype has to do with illegal immigration and how that's overwhelming the nation. If you look at this cartoon, caricature here, we see on one side of this fence, we see the United States, and the other side is Mexico. In the United States side, you'll see that there's free lemonade, jobs, free health care, free education, and then a big sign saying USA, keep out. And then on the other side, you have people, there's one person at a table with maps to the U.S. and people sort of sneaking underneath the fence to get here. And this is often the stereotype of what immigrants are doing to sneak into the United States. Another is the overwhelming the overwhelming psychological effects of having so many immigrants come to the United States on people who do not consider themselves immigrants. And so this idea that we are being overwhelmed in this country and that people and immigrants are taking our jobs. So these are very typical kinds of narratives, and that they're frightening, that they're terrorists. And then this is often not talked about. This is the unspoken part of the narrative, is that this idea that they are forcing us to change our life. Why should people within the United States change their lives to accommodate immigrants and their children? So here you see this photograph with the flag. Why the hell should I have to press 1 for English? And speaking specifically to the use of Spanish language in the United States. So this is the backdrop. And so when we think about all of these socio-political, contextual issues and policy issues, and we think about, well, how does this all affect how one adapts, how immigrants and refugees adapt in the new context? In psychology, we use the term acculturation to describe the process by which immigrants experience as they adapt to the new country. And acculturation can be stressful, particularly when you have two different cultures or two or more different cultures that are in conflict with each other. So oftentimes we see cultural values that feel very different and contradictory to one another. And so how do you reconcile those differences in your own mind and in your relationships with people? And one of the misnomers about acculturation is that it is something that it has an endpoint, that you start acculturating, you learn English, and then you learn the customs, perhaps, of your neighborhood or your school, and then you adapt to that, and then it's done. And the reality is acculturation is a lifelong process. Immigrants and refugees are negotiating their sense of belonging, their sense of adopting new customs, retaining heritage customs throughout the course of their lives, and that changes with development. So how an adolescent may experience the United States and their heritage culture may differ greatly when they become adults and older adults, when they have children of their own, when they have spouses, when they make decisions about the type of work that they're going to be engaged in. All of those developmental transitions impact how somebody adapts and acculturates. The age of when somebody immigrates also matters. So the older immigrant, adult immigrants versus young children, have different responses to how much they want to retain in terms of their heritage culture and their and the new culture. And oftentimes adults will struggle with, and parents in particular will struggle with, how much do I retain in the heritage culture. And every time I separate from the heritage culture, I'm also separating from the birth country or the country of origin. And this presents a psychological dilemma for immigrants and refugees in ways that are unanticipated often from the beginning point of the migration process. I also wondered a great deal about, in my own research, about the ways that we see children kind of adjusting to situations that are in flux. So, for example, I'm very interested in the dynamic nature of identity development and how children, adolescents, and adults decide and label themselves. And what we see is a great range of immigrants' experiences around self-definition. So, for example, there are first-generation Asian Indians consider themselves oftentimes Asian Indian. Some may consider themselves Indian American. So I'm speaking from my own ethnic background. And then, however, I see second-generation Indian Americans calling themselves Indian Americans or Asian Americans or people of color. So there's variation across generations as well, and a large part of that stems from differences in acculturation between generations. I want to say a couple of things about acculturative stress. Acculturative stress refers to the stress that accompanies the acculturation process. And what we know in psychology research very definitively is that acculturative stress is linked to negative psychological outcomes. So things like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, eating disorders, we see that acculturative stress is linked to these problems. And discrimination is a component of acculturative stress. And as I mentioned before, immigrants of color experience higher levels of stress. So when you look at the demographic trends in the United States, we see that immigrants compose primarily immigrants of color in the past several decades. And we see higher levels of acculturative stress for immigrants of color. I mentioned earlier the uncertainty of immigration policy and deportation. This is on the minds of so many people. And I will say that even post-election in November, I spoke to countless people who are U.S. citizens but are of immigrant origin, immigrants of color, who the day after the election worried about their safety and their security. Worried about being deported even though they had U.S. passports. So this is the psychological life that I'm referring to. Now, whether you might see that as a reality happening or not, we know that in history in various countries around the world that was a reality. So this pervades the fantasy of many immigrants of color and certainly refugees who are seeking asylum and are in process of hearing back around that. So all of this stress, in recent times in particular, it's heightened severely post-election and since the inauguration of President Trump. And there is a deep level of stress that immigrants and refugees face in terms of identity. So are we able to hide identity? First of all, if you're an immigrant of color, it's very hard to hide the fact that you're a person of color because of our skin color, perhaps, or the shape of our eyelids, or our hair texture, and so on, the phenotype. But there are other aspects of identity that people have wondered, should we hide this? So should a young Muslim woman who wonders, should she wear her hijab? And what does the hijab mean during this particular time in our country's history? I know several patients of mine and clients of mine who have decided not to wear their ethnic heritage clothing in public, but rather in private, more so now than I have seen in the last many years. Although I've seen it, I remember seeing this more in the aftermath of 9/11 due to some of the backlash against Middle Eastern Americans, North Africans, and South Asians. So these are the kinds of things that are in the minds of people in terms of securing safety. I want to take my presentation over to thinking about what happens within families just for a moment. I won't cover everything in this slide, but I'll say a couple of things. So how does the external climate affect family relationships, and what are the gaps, perhaps, in acculturation between parents and children? Oftentimes, parents in families are oriented to the heritage culture in the hopes of maintaining that across generation and certainly for their children. The children, however, are exposed to various multicultural contexts and tend to be oriented towards the host culture. And so when you have this difference, we call this acculturation gaps, because it's not just a gap that is sort of like a generational gap, but it's also a gap in terms of cultural worldviews that develop over time and change over time. And so another issue that comes up with immigrant families is that even though people within the family, different family members may be experiencing stress, perhaps discrimination, difficulties, barriers around language, workplace issues, they may each be experiencing different types of stress outside the home, but may never talk about it as a family. So oftentimes the stress is unspoken within the family, and a large part of this reason is because people don't want to burden each other in the family, and that's often how it's perceived, that if I start to talk about my own personal distress, that it's going to become a burden to mother or father or grandparents who is working so hard to keep the family in place and keep moving. So these are some of the issues, and so we have difficulties with parents and children. Children not turning to parents with problems, and parents struggling to communicate, oftentimes with the child or with the school, trying to figure out an appropriate type of sense of autonomy and supervision in this new cultural context. I want to move to telling you a little bit about mental health issues. I want to wrap up with this piece. Denzel had mentioned briefly that the 1.5 generation seems to have better outcomes than second or third generation immigrants educationally and behaviorally. And this is what we see in psychology research with immigrants of color, that we see something called the immigrant paradox, where first-generation immigrants, those born outside of the U.S., raised outside the U.S., and arrive as adults, tend to have less psychological distress compared to second-generation immigrants. So the longer one stays in the U.S., the worse the mental health outcomes and the educational outcomes seem to become. And there are many reasons for why that might be, in the sense that the different acculturation, different variations that I just mentioned are thought to be a part of that problem. But most of the mental health issues that we see in the immigrant and refugee experience is linked to acculturation, discrimination, and trauma. So we have, when we think about acculturation-based problems, some of this I've mentioned already, there are intergenerational conflicts, but also changes in family structure, gender roles, within marriages and relationships that can lead to psychological stress. trauma-based presenting issues as well. There's trauma throughout the process of migration and post-migration, and also interpersonal violence. That is often something that's silenced within communities, and there's a lack of access to resources for survivors of interpersonal violence outside the community. And then we have discrimination and racism-based problems. We know that racism and over time has a huge psychological toll on individuals. This is true for African Americans, immigrants, Native American Indians, and indigenous populations. And we have this ongoing problem of profiling and deportation. So the last slide here speaks to some recommendations. So what do we need in terms of addressing some of these problems? One is creating more safe spaces within and outside of school context for dialogues about cultural adjustment, both positive and negative aspects of that. Education around cultural and linguistic adjustment with students and their parents, and training for school personnel. This is for college settings, university settings as well. And then increasing access to support by building awareness in communities about mental health, emotional well-being, which is often a stigmatized topic in communities in the United States. And then also understanding that policy and immigration status plays a big role in how people are feeling and doing psychologically. And finally, addressing any barriers around bridging school, family, and the student themselves. So let me wrap up with that.
Thank you, Dr. Usha. We have a few minutes for some questions. And I was wondering, in your recommendations, you talk about different ways that you can essentially get teachers and administrators to understand what this acculturated stress of their students. That may not be the easiest thing to implement in a school, that kind of professional development that you're talking about. But can you describe perhaps an example of something that you've seen where teachers were able to listen to the stories of their students, or a program of professional development, what that looks like?
Yes. In fact, a few years ago, I was engaged in some research in a high school where the student community is very diverse and largely diverse in terms of immigration and countries of origin, where kids and the parents arrive to the U.S. from. And one of the things that happened was that with my research team was that we did both individual interviews and some focus group discussions with kids from 9th through 12th grade. And they talked a great deal about not being able to have spaces to actually talk about their experiences of immigration. Rather, it was imposed, whatever perception that people had of them, it was imposed on them. And that's sort of what people interacted around, were the perceptions rather than the real experience of it. And so we had the administration and the teachers, several teachers, took an interest in learning more about the immigrant experience. It was sort of a product of this research program. And there was a panel that we developed with kids, with students and their and parents and teachers, to talk about this experience. And some of the teachers who had immigrant experiences or immigrant parents were able to share their thoughts as well. So I think, there's a way in which, certainly research should not remain in a journal only, but rather it has to be used. That information that researchers are gathering about students' experience can then be linked into real dialogue and conversation that leads to some more awareness within a community.
We had several students at our learning center who were interviewed for a journal article, and what they're experiencing right now, the fear, the uncertainty, and one of them commented that when she picks up her child from school, the child asks that she not speak because the other children will make fun of her accent. And someone else who said, the child asked her, "Mommy, do I have to be Muslim?" I wonder about parents and ways to engage with parents. many of us know that a lot of immigrant parents sort of try to brush aside the immigrant experience and just sort of not focus on the stress, but focus on moving forward, and those things get swept aside. How do we engage with parents to sort of get into that dialogue with their children or with teachers to talk more openly about it and find ways of dealing with it?
I think that one way to engage parents is to tie this into the curriculum itself in some way, because if understanding diverse experiences is a part of school curriculum, and it then speaks to this being a core value of that school, both from the administrative and faculty point of view. And if that's something that can be communicated to parents, that actually we really value this. Otherwise, parents are interpreting, what happens to their child as something that is isolated perhaps, or maybe even prevalent, but something that cannot be spoken about in the school context. Otherwise, their child might suffer if they actually try to intervene on behalf of their children and speak up about maybe some type of injustice or unfair treatment or discrimination that the child is facing. So parents are often in this dilemma of, well, how much can I advocate for, because they're not clear on how safe their children are or how safe they might be. So unless the school sort of develops this as a core part of what they do and encourage parents to speak up when that happens, not just sort of once or twice, but really have that in their materials and have that as a message of the school, it's very difficult for parents to know what to do in those cases. And they may try to teach the child then to set it aside or minimize it as a way of protecting them or teaching them how to protect themselves.
And I want everyone to look over her slides, especially that last one with the recommendations on what schools and teachers can do. In small ways, these things can be implemented. And I do want to note that you spoke a lot about telling stories, and we're going to have a great module coming up on storytelling. And we will also be looking at ways to integrate immigration into the curriculum. As you said, and letting parents and teachers know that this is part of their learning, how they learn is crucial. I want to leave we had some questions about additional resources, and I know you mentioned some in the webinar last year. Perhaps you can just give us some websites or some books that would be helpful on this topic.
Yes, I can send that over to you, Denzel, to share with everyone. Recently there more and more groups are trying to provide advocacy and pro bono services as well. So I'll try to send you as many resources as I can and links, and just in terms of also reading about the psychology of immigration and refugees as well.
All right, we'll be sure to send that to everyone, and I do want people to note some great ideas coming up in the chat box. Syrian refugees, young children. When a social worker and translator came into the picture, it made the world of difference. Some really excellent points, and we will try to pull those out of the chat box and send it to everyone at the end of these 2 days. So unless there are other questions for Dr. Usha, I want to thank her very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I haven't had a chance to read through the comments, but I will, and I really appreciate everybody's input. Thank you.